Greetings. Welcome back to our study on becoming God's people. We're looking at the books of Genesis through Deuteronomy and talking about how Israel became God's people and what that can teach us for our own journey with God today. This week, we are looking at the golden calf incident between chapters 32 and 34 of Exodus. This is often described as the epitome of sinfulness, and in some ways, that's very true. Israel has just received the covenant from God, and the first thing they do after receiving the covenant is they violate the terms of the covenant. But that is an important lesson for us, not about human nature only, but about what the covenant is all about. You see, the first thing we have to recognize is, yes, Israel's behavior is what we would call sinful. It is something contrary to God. They get these commands not to build idols, not to have other gods, to honor father and mother, to keep Sabbath, all these commands. And the first thing they do is violate at least one of them in making the golden calf. Now, it's arguable that they violated two by having other gods, but I'm not 100% convinced on that. I don't know that they were worshiping any god other than their God who brought them out of Egypt. I think that some of the language that is used about this scene is intentionally ambiguous because it shows us where their own self-centeredness sets them up for worshiping other gods. So they use the plural Elohim, which with plural verbs, which usually means make gods for us, as in plural gods. But when Aaron actually makes the calf, he says to Israel, "Here are your gods. Now we're going to celebrate the Lord." And that to me indicates that the plurals are used to give a little ambiguity about what their worship is, and they are truly still worshiping the Lord who brought them out of Egypt, but they're doing it in a bad way. Likewise, there's some language in there about dancing, which the language has sexual overtones and sexual connotations. So there's a little bit of ambiguity about whether they are dancing or whether this has turned into some sort of ritualistic sexual encounters. There's ambiguity there, and I think that's intentional on the part of the author. The author wants you to see that because the people are following their own path instead of listening to God, they are setting themselves up for disaster. Even if the disaster is relatively mild at the point, it would snowball. I think there's a little bit of that. And it's important to notice that the people are creating this idol as a place to hear from God. What they want is not to worship new gods. They don't say that they want to worship new gods. They recognize that Moses, the one who has mediated the relationship between them and their God, is gone. What they need is a new mediator. They need a new place to hear from God and to speak to God. The irony is God and Moses are talking about this very thing up on top of the mountain. So while God and Moses are talking about how is God going to mediate between the divine world and our world, that's exactly what the people down below are doing. But instead of waiting on God, they're taking the matter into their own hands and their own creativity. Now, that is where the breakdown is. They are not listening to God's instructions on all of this. They are using their resources, the earrings, the gold that they got from Egypt, their resources, in a way that seems fit to them, rather than waiting, because they have not gotten the instructions. We have them. We have read the instructions for tabernacle, but they have not. So they haven't read these. They don't know these. And instead of waiting for God's instruction on how to use their resources, they are using them in their own interests, in their own self-interests, on an idol that they can control. And all of this feeds back into the concept of what is the covenant. Now, we tend to think of the Old Testament as laws and rules and regulations that you have to follow in order to maintain a healthy relationship with God. But that is not the case. The Old Testament is very much about God's mercy. God chooses Abraham, not because Abraham is holy or righteous or doing good things, but because God is merciful on Abraham. God tells Abraham, here is how you can behave to be more like me, and so that our relationship can grow closer. And when Abraham doesn't abide by that, God has mercy and reminds Abraham of the covenant. And Abraham tries again. And the pattern with Abraham is Abraham falls, and then finally Abraham learns and grows and becomes more like God. The same is true in Exodus. The people of Israel are chosen because they cry out to God in their suffering. God's mercy comes down on them, God's compassion as the people who are being mistreated and abused. God's merciful on them. God selects them and chooses them and takes them out of the land of Egypt, out of the bondage, out of the torture, and sets them up. And the first thing we see after that is Israel rejects God, and yet God has mercy. And Israel rejects God again, and God has mercy again. And then God comes to Israel at Sinai and says, let's make a covenant, let's make a pact. And you would think that God's relationship with Israel is based on that covenant, but you'd be wrong, because the covenant is about God is going to covenant with them. I am going to be your God. I am going to be merciful to you. I'm going to continue with you. And the people, their covenant is we are going to act more like God, more like this divine being who has brought us out of Egypt. Now, the first thing they do is they break the covenant, but that doesn't end the covenant. God still chooses to show mercy to them, and God has compassion and gives them another chance. This is the pattern that will continue on and on and on and on. It is not about rules and regulations. It is about people wanting to listen to God, to grow closer to God, to be more like God. Now, that is important for us because we now see that God's mercy is always there. Our response to God's mercy is to try to be more like God, but our relationship with God is not based on our keeping the rules. It is based on God's grace and mercy, just like it was to the people. God continuously shows mercy, and we continuously try to live more like God. So that's a quick overview of that. I did want to touch on a couple of little points. Number one is the idea of earrings. The earrings used for the construction of the calf. Now, in the Old Testament, earrings seem to have two purposes. One is to show service, to show servitude or slave status. If a man was going to keep, if a man had a slave and that slave did not want to leave the master's house, the master was supposed to take the man over to the door frame and pierce his ear with an awl, and presumably put an earring in as a sign of willing bondage and willing servitude. That was one element. And the other element is there seems to be a religious aspect to these earrings, that they are what we call cultic. That means that they represent a deity. So the idea being that Israel is giving over their service, their deity, their deification to the to this golden calf, which, whether it was meant to be a calf that the god was supposed to ride on top of, or whether it was supposed to represent the god, we don't know. That's up for debate. But in some way, they were giving over their loyalty to it. The giving of the earrings, and not just random pieces of gold, is symbolic of them giving over service and something to this god. And that, again, goes back to this idea that God is trying to design a tabernacle, a dwelling place that is supposed to serve the exact same role as this calf. And those earrings should have been put towards the gold needed in that project rather than the gold put towards the golden calf. The second thing I want to talk about, and I'm not going to hit on it at all in my treatment of this, but it's when Moses grinds up the calf at the end of this story. Moses destroys the calf, grinds up the gold, puts it into the water, mixes it, and has the people drink the water. This event is very similar to the the punishment described for a woman who is suspected of adultery, where dirt from the floor is to be swept up and mixed with water and blessed by the priest. And then if the woman drinks the water and nothing happens, then she is not guilty of adultery. But if she drinks the water and she is ill, then she is guilty of adultery. Now, there seems to be some elements that are similar. And what we notice here is that the people come out clean. They drink the water and nothing happens. No divine wrath, which again goes back to the idea of God's mercy and compassion for the people, that God is not going to judge them permanently guilty, not going to destroy them based on this event. It's another element, another demonstration of God's mercy, of God's abundant mercy. It's also worthy of pointing out in this passage in Exodus 34, the tail end of this story. God says to Moses, I am the Lord, merciful and compassionate, long of nose, or abundantly patient, showing mercy to, or punishing the wicked to the third and fourth generation, but showing mercy to the 1,000th generation, to those who follow me. The idea being that God is very merciful, and while God does punish injustice and wrongdoers, God's mercy triumphs over all of that punishment, all of that divine justice. God's mercy will outweigh that. And this verse, Exodus 34, it's really 6 through 8 if you look it up. That section, that description of God is the most repeated description of God in the Bible. It occurs, I think, 8 or 10 times in the Old Testament alone. It is the description of God's character. And so when we're thinking about God's character, Exodus 34 is the place where we need to start. That is God, in the words of the Bible, that is God's own self-description for who God is. That is, when we think of who God is, our framework has to start with that. If our framework for God does not match that description, our framework for God is wrong in some level. And what is the framework that God gives? Just, yes. Punishing evil, yes. But abundantly merciful, willing to work with us and help us to grow to be more like God. That is a wonderful promise, especially for those of us who sometimes find it difficult to forgive ourselves and find it difficult to allow others to forgive us for our wrongs, and find it difficult to put our wrongs behind us and accept our growth. It's not a license to continue to act and behave in a way that is that is counter to God, but it's a wonderful mercy to us that God doesn't expect us to get it right on the first try. Instead, works with us to grow and become better over the course of days, weeks, months, years, lifetimes. So with all that said, as always, I hope you check out the reflection. If there's any questions or comments, please drop them. I'd love to interact with you on this. And until we meet again, God bless.